push the live button and then everything after this will be live.
Thank you, David. All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to our Social Work Advisory Committee meeting. I'm Andrea Perdomo Morales, and I serve as the co-chair of the Social Work Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Carolyn Sasfron.
Present. Present.
Thank you. Donna Honer-Quayle.
Present.
Thank you. Sarah Behrens.
Present.
Thank you. Mary Gill.
Present.
Thank you. And I see Mike Gillette is not on yet. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Thank you. Leanne Gendry as well.
That's correct.
All right. Angie Heller Workman.
Here.
Thank you. Jane Holtz Richter.
Present.
Thank you. Catherine Reek. Sorry, can you help me pronounce your name correctly? I'm sorry.
Sure, it's back.
Rec. All right. Appreciate that. And Robin Unruh.
Here, and it's Unruh.
Unruh. Thank you, Robin.
No problem.
I will my pronunciations there on the side of there. Apologies for that.
No worries.
And Andrea, did you recognize Eric?
Yeah.
Schoenmaker?
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have Eric. I apologize.
It's Shinniker and I'm present.
Shinniger. Thank you, Eric, for joining us. All right. Did I miss any of the members? And we'll move to staff here. Okay. I also note the following BSRB staff members are present. We have David Fye.
Here.
And Leslie Allen.
Here.
Thank you both. Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director of the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require advisory committees to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting to allow for the committee sufficient time to complete items on the agenda, and also no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While this meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended. Therefore, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On December 17th, 2021, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting materials have been posted to the board's website, and you may request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line, request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I just want to double check that there's no individuals on the conference call. If you are on the conference call, go ahead and identify yourself. Okay, if I hear any beeps, I will go ahead and let you know that someone has called in on the conference call.
Thank you, David. The meeting is now called to order and the advisory committee will begin its discussion on the first item on the agenda. All right, well, welcome. Happy New Year to everyone. Appreciate you joining us this afternoon as Carolyn is the co-chair of this committee. as well. Really wanted to start with agenda approval. Hopefully everybody received via email the agenda and attachments. Are there any adjustments or changes needed to the agenda before we approve? All right, so with that, may I get a motion to approve the agenda as is for February 15th?
I would so move.
Thank you, Donna. Can I get
I
a
will
second?
second.
Thank you, Jane. Any opposed? All right, all those in favor say aye.
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 Thank you. The agenda is approved for today. The next item on our agenda is review and approval of minutes from previous meetings. You do have two attachments, one from October 19th and the other from November 3rd. If there's any motions to approve, we can move forward with that if there's not any discussion or amendments needed.
I move to approve the October minutes.
Thank you, Angie. We have a motion to approve October minutes. Is there a second?
I second that.
Thank
Motion.
you, Carolyn. Any opposed? All right, all those in favor say aye, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. October 19 meeting minutes are approved. And now we have the November 3rd meeting minutes.
I move that we approve the November 3rd minutes.
Thank you, Carolyn. A second?
Second.
Thank you, Donna. All those, any opposed? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 November 3rd are approved, minutes are approved. Thank you all for that. The next item, moving right along, we're very excited to introduce our new advisory committee members that are here with us. I see lots of clapping going on. This committee has been anxiously awaiting all of you. So thank you for agreeing to make this commitment to the board and to the Kansas constituents. So we're very excited. We'd like to ask each of you to do just a brief introduction so that the other committee members can get to know who you are and just share a little bit about what brought you, what was your interest in being here at the Bsrb Social Work Advisory Committee, and any other details, just maybe 2 minutes each. That would be great. If we can start with Sarah.
Hello, I'm Sarah Behrens, and I am a clinical director at KVC in Hayes, the Children's Psych Hospital. I became interested in this opportunity just to sort of be involved in the macro level of things. I'm really interested in developing others, and that really starts with the social workers that I've seen as students and, carried through in their employment. So just excited to have this opportunity to be a part of that bigger picture and support social work.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for joining. Next, we have Mary.
Yes. Hi, I'm Mary Gill, and I am a field placement coordinator with Tabor College in Hillsborough. And I also recently, at the end of January, took on part-time employment with Junction City Dialysis. So that will keep me or put me back into the field and keep my skills honed. I'm also working on my doctorate in social work, in medical social work, and hopefully we'll be finishing that soon, but I'm doing that through Walden University. What has brought me here is certainly working with the field placement students, and I recognize how important it is for us to have people who are competent and capable out there. And I already have, going through the materials, it even gives me far more respect for that. And I want to convey that to students, and also want to learn more about what some of the concerns are that bring people before the committee. And so I can be more informative to the students as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. All right, next we have Catherine. Do you prefer Catherine or Katie?
Please call me Katie.
Katie. Katie. Okay.
Catherine is my mother calls me when I'm in trouble, so I prefer for Catherine. I am currently the social services director at Plaza West in Topeka. That's a long-term care facility. And I've been here for about 3 years. And I was interested in participating because when I was a student and I did my practicum placement, I worked for KNASW and monitored the Bsrb and was involved in some legislative actions related to the social work practice. And so that's something I've been interested in my entire career. So I'm just excited to be directly involved.
Thank you, Katie. I think you cut out right there at the end.
Sorry, we have not really good internet service here, so hopefully I can stay with you the whole time.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. Next, we have Eric.
I'm Eric Schenecker. I'm a psychologist 3 for the Parsons State Hospital and Training Center. I've also been in private practice for a couple of years, and I'm a lecturer, instructor at Pittsburgh State University. So I do a number of roles. I'm also the director of our Healthy Sexual Behavior program here at the state hospital. I got interested in this because as an instructor, a lot of students ask questions about the Behavior Science and Regulatory Board, and I wanted to be able to give more thoughtful and informed responses. I also am very interested in the legislative piece and really enjoy seeing how our legislative body and our legislative representatives represent us in Topeka. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Eric. Well, we will give you all a virtual round of applause to welcome you to the advisory committee. Thank you for your time and your commitment. Really appreciate that. We're looking forward to having you join us on these committee work meetings that we have. So with that, we'll move forward with our executive director's report.
Thank you, Andrea. And I thought I heard a beep on the conference call. So if someone is on the conference call, could you go ahead and say your name?
Well, I think this is Jane. We just lost total power here.
Okay.
And I went out on the computer, and so I'm on my phone. So I don't know if I'm going to come back on the computer or not, but it's probably me.
Okay. Well, thank you for clearing that up. We can hear you great now. So.
Okay. All right.
Great. Okay. So I am David Fye. I'm the executive director for the BSRB, and I appreciate the opportunity to meet the 4 new members today as well. I'm communicating with each of you over email, but it's nice to be able to put a face with a name. And I look forward to working with all of you more over the next couple of years and beyond. And so at each advisory committee meeting, I provide a report to the advisory committee about some number of agency updates and also some legislative updates right now, especially because it's the legislative session. So I'll go ahead and summarize some of these items. So under the agency updates, I wanted to let you all know that as of January 4th of 2022, most of our staff has returned to working in the office full-time. Prior to January 4th, we had been under a direction by the governor's office, as we are an executive agency. The governor had previously said that most employees are to work remotely if they are able to do so. And so we kept most of our staff working from home the vast majority of the week. Each of them was able to work a limited number of days in the office, but now they're all back. In the fall, we had worked and developed a telework pilot program, and we were rolling that out slowly to test its effectiveness, and it had been approved by the Department of Administration. That was temporarily paused when staff was asked to return to working remotely due to the pandemic. But now that we're back to working mostly in the office, we are relaunching that telework pilot program, and 2 individuals in our staff are currently utilizing that. We have 2 individuals who serve as investigators for the BSRB, one full-time investigator and one part-time. She has some responsibilities on the licensing side of the office as well. And so each of them, based on the nature of their work, they are able to work from home. It's a little bit better of an environment for some of those phone calls with individuals when they call in with complaints against practitioners. And so we are going ahead and collecting information on how this is working, with an idea that maybe we could expand this to other employees after this pilot ends, roughly around June or so of this year. So that is what we are currently operating under. Additionally, we have previously had an open position for an administrative assistant here at the BSRB. We had some difficulty identifying candidates, but we were able to select a really great one. Her name is Tyler Wadsworth, and she has been working with the office here for about the last 2 months now. And we're really excited to have her on board, and she's been learning things very quickly and adding a lot of positive things around the office. And so we're really happy to be working with Tyler going forward. In terms of some board updates, each year, the Board of the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board has an annual in-person meeting for planning purposes. And a lot of the legislative objectives are decided at that meeting. Sometimes it kind of wraps up a lot of the committee work that the advisory committees have been working on over the course of the year. Well, this fall, because of the pandemic, the board was not able to meet in person, but that usually happens sometime around September. And so what the board did is the board had an in-person, a Zoom meeting for that planning meeting, and decided, because of the Zoom nature of the meeting, to go ahead and split it and have a half day at the end of September and a half day at the end of October. And at those two meetings, the board discussed a number of different items relevant to the professionals it regulates, and made some decisions and looked at some internal governing documents, made some decisions on those. And a number of those changes were confirmed by the board when the board met in January. And so I'm just going to highlight a few of those documents for you now. In the past, a long time ago, the board had agreed to a document called the Board Governance Policy. And it was created many years ago and last updated back in 2011. But in the years that have passed since that time, some of the board's operating processes had changed, and the document really needed a thorough review and updating. And so the board spent time with myself and legal counsel, and we brought the board some questions. And the end result was that it split the document into two new documents. One is an expectations of board members document, and the other is an advisory committee policy. And those are a bit different than how they appeared previously in the board governance policy. But those policies were adopted by the board at the January board meeting, and both are posted on the BSRB's website. And during the training for advisory committee members later today, I'll be referencing those documents and telling you a little bit more about them. Additionally, in past years, there really has not been a lot of public attendees at BSRB board meetings or advisory committee meetings. But last January, we launched the BSRB YouTube channel, and we began broadcasting our meetings live and having that channel available for individuals to go back and watch the work of the board and the advisory committees. And with that, we've had a number of individuals who have asked more questions of the board office about things that the board is working on. And also a few more people asked to attend meetings to provide public comment than maybe traditional years. And so we saw the need to have a document to provide some guidance for public attendees to let them know the process that we would follow in terms of public comment, and also to let them know what would be expected of them when they talk to the board or the advisory committees about what subject matter would be good for public comment and what other information would be really beneficial for us to receive, but may not be appropriate for public comment. For example, if they wish to provide information about maybe a complaint against a practitioner, that's something that would have to be received through the investigation and complaint process in a confidential manner, so that we can ensure that we're being fair to all licensees and also members of the public to keep that process consistent. And so we outlined a number of those procedural type items and posted a new policy document for the public, and that is available for review on our website as well. Additionally, there was a bill that passed the legislature last year. It was House Bill 2066, and it involved a change in the time frame for processing licenses for applicants who were military members and military spouses, and it involved a couple other groups of individuals. But it also provided a different path to licensure for those individuals if they are applied under reciprocity. And it shortened the amount of years of practice in those jurisdictions to 1 year if they met other qualifications. Well, we also have in statute the ability to provide provisional licenses to individuals, usually when they're pretty close to meeting the requirements, but they're in a situation to where they're within about a year of meeting all the qualifications. Sometimes you might have someone who is like one class short or something like that. And so they can receive a provisional license if they have been approved by the board to do so. And so we brought to the board at that January meeting how to go ahead and take these two things and how should the agency interpret these two policies. Should they be connected, or are they separate tracks? And we received guidance from the board and also from legal counsel for the board for the Attorney General's office. And legal counsel specified that these were separate tracks for licensure. The provisions under 2066 individuals could apply through, and separately they could apply to receive a provisional license if they met the qualifications there, but that these aren't meant to overlap and be used in combination. So going forward after that, we were able to clarify that in case there were questions that came up on that issue. Additionally, in the fall, we have maybe about a little over 1,000 individuals who hold more than one license under the Bsrb. And there have been requests here and there for individuals who wanted to sync the expiration dates for their licenses to the same time, so that they would all come due at the same time period. They would pay their fees at the same time. So we had asked the advisory committees to discuss that if they thought a change to statute to allow that would be appropriate. The reason we don't have flexibility to do that currently is because the statute clarifies the time period for licensure. And so in statute, those licensure periods are, for most of the professions, 2 years from the date the license is issued. For licensed psychologists, a little bit different because they renew every June of even numbered years. But for most professions, it's that 2-year period. And we're not able to extend that or shorten that without some statutory flexibility. So the board discussed that. The general consensus was there are individuals who may not want those 2 dates to sync up because they would like to spread out the fees or spread out the requirements in terms of continuing education hours. And so we are going to be pursuing some language to provide this as an option, but not make it mandatory for licensees going forward. So that's something we'll be working on with the board this year to come up with a draft of how this could be accomplished. And it would have to go into a bill to become part of the statute. So the earliest we could bring this to the legislature would be spring of next year. And the last topic, so there are situations that come up a number of times a year, maybe 2 or so a year, where an individual passes away and that individual is an independent practitioner and there's no logical custodian for their records. And there's also situations sometimes where records might be abandoned. And the question is, what can be done with those records to ensure public protection? The Attorney General's Office Consumer Protection Division will seize records in certain cases. And we were trying to be helpful looking at the issue of should practitioners be asked to name the next custodian of their records should something happen to them unexpectedly. And so the general consensus was that yes, this was something that under the professional responsibility standards, there's a general consensus that perhaps this would be something that could be asked about on a renewal license. One of the questions to name who the next custodian of the documents would be. But there were some logistical questions that we anticipated that we need to work through first. For example, we expect there to be questions about how would someone go about the process of naming the next custodian of their records and what steps they actually have to take just by naming someone, what are the next steps for that process. And also the Attorney General's office, initially we believed they would seize records in several different situations. Now we have worked more with them and clarified that topic, and they will seize records if they're in danger of the public getting access to them. But if they're in a secure environment, they may not seize those records. So we still need to work through a number of these issues, but that's something else we'll be working on with the board over the course of this year. In terms of some legislative updates, the legislative session began earlier last month, January 10th. And legislation was requested on behalf of the board of the Bsrb. The Bsrb bill this year is Senate Bill 387. And Senate Bill 387 included 3 items. The first, under the social work area, last year there was a bill that was initially offered by the Bsrb. That was House Bill 2208. And that bill did pass the legislature, although it passed in a very different form. It became what you might call a vehicle for other health topics as it went through the legislative process, and a number of other topics were amended into the bill. As part of that amendment process, there was an amendment that was put on the bill to strike the specific number of direct client contact hours as part of a clinical practicum for individuals seeking the clinical level of license for social workers. However, the amendment went on to strike or other postgraduate supervised experience as determined by the board. And when the bill had gone into effect, we had legal counsel review all of the language in the bill as it was finalized. to see, are there any issues that we might need to clean up? And we were told that based on that language that was struck, the board is no longer able to evaluate candidates who have a different type of practicum. For example, in the past, we were able to evaluate candidates who had received an administrative practicum, and as long as they met other qualifications, we could review their submissions as they sought clinical licensure. But with that language struck, we're no longer able to do that. We don't believe the intent of the amendment was to make it more restrictive. It just happened to be an impact, inadvertent, we believe. So we have asked the legislature to add back the language to allow for other postgraduate experience to be evaluated by the board. We're not seeking for the number of hours to be put back into statute. We're just asking for that flexibility that previously existed to be returned to the statute so that we can determine what those requirements would be in rules and regulations and then move forward. The second item that's included in the bill is under the addiction counselor profession. So currently in statute, most master's level or higher practitioners under the Bsrb are able to use that status to test for the master's level addiction counselor license. However, we have received some requests for individuals who are having difficulty with that examination, and they requested the flexibility to take the lower level licensed addiction counselor examination. However, the way the statute is phrased, we don't have that flexibility to do that, in part because it's a different examination. And so we're not able to let individuals test for the lower level license. But we don't believe that would be something that would hurt public protection. So we brought it to the board, and the board went ahead and approved for that to be put into our bill. And so that is included as one of the items in Senate Bill 387. The third item was during last year, each of the advisory committees discussed the topic of whether a continuing education requirement should be changed as the requirements for licensure. And the specific proposal that was discussed was, should there be a requirement of 3 continuing education hours in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And that DEI requirement would be required for each of the professions. And a lot of the professions already require 3 hours of ethics and 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment. But the final proposal was that if someone took 3 hours of ethics that also involved the topic of DEI, that would satisfy that requirement. Or if 3 of the 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment also involved DEI, that would satisfy the requirement. The final version that got put into the bill was only for the licensed psychology profession. And so that was the third part of Senate Bill 387. So Senate Bill 387 was requested by the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. There was a hearing for that on Wednesday, February 9th. And then on that Friday, the committee worked the bill. And when I say worked the bill, that's their opportunity to discuss it and then make amendments or vote it out favorably or not voted out. And the committee amended the bill to strike the language that would have required the 3 hours of continuing education in diversity, equity, and inclusion for licensed psychologists, but left the remaining 2 other provisions, the one for social work and the one for addiction counselor. Those 2 are still in the bill. So after amending out the licensed psychology DEI section, they moved it out of committee favorably for passage. And the way that things work with the legislature, so it moves out of the committee, and then the next step is it is read in on the floor of the Senate chamber. And so on Monday afternoon, when the Senate met, they read into the record that it was reported out of committee favorable, and that means that it's available to be worked on the Senate floor. And so today I sent a message to the president of the Senate, Ty Masterson, and also copied the chair of the Public Health and Welfare Committee, Senator Richard Hildebrandt. And I respectfully requested that the Senate consider working our bill on the Senate floor. There's no guarantee that it will be worked, but I am hopeful that they will work the bill. And if it is worked, then what would happen is it would move to, if it's worked and then it is passed, if it passes out of the Senate, the next step would be that it would go to the House and it would be assigned to a House committee. And then we would work with that committee chair to try to get a hearing for the bill on the House side, and then hope it moves through the process the same way. If the House committee were to vote it out favorably, and then the House floor were to work that bill, if it's the same version of the bill, then it would go to the governor's office. If it's changed in any way, It would go to something called conference committee where they would resolve their differences, and then it would need to be voted out by the both chambers again with any final versions. So it is moving through the process. It's in a good place, but I'll continue to keep you updated as that bill makes its way through the process. Another legislative item I wanted to make you aware of: each year the agency's budget has to be approved by both the House and the Senate. The last year's legislature approved a budget for not only fiscal year 21, but also 22 and 23. We are currently in state fiscal year 22. This year, we're asked to go ahead and make revisions to the approved budget for 22 and also to submit any revisions to the budget for fiscal year 23. So we went to the House Higher Education Committee. They asked a lot of questions on our budget, but ultimately voted it out of committee favorable. And then the chair went to House Appropriations, and it was voted out of House Appropriations favorable with no changes. On the Senate side, it was heard in the Senate Transportation and Ethics Committee, and they passed it out favorably with no changes. And then it was reported out this past Friday from the Senate Ways and Means Committee. So what this means for the agency's budget is that it is essentially done unless there are other items that might come up at the end of the legislative session. That's a period of time we call omnibus, or there might be something that would affect all agencies, and that would apply to us as well. But the main items involving our budget are pretty much done. And then under other legislative items, we are monitoring bills that might have a connection to the BSRB in case the board needs to meet to review those. I have been looking, and there are a couple that reference the BSRB, but those bills have not been scheduled for hearings yet. Should those bills be scheduled for hearings, I will ask the board to meet to go ahead and discuss those bills to see if they would like me to introduce any testimony in regards to any of the changes in those bills. And then one last item in terms of other updates. Recently, at the end of January, I was invited to attend a conference for the Federation of Associations of Regulatory Boards. It's a group called FARB, and it's a combination of different regulatory boards from lots of different states and different areas. And those individuals with that association asked me to come to the conference to speak to the conferees, specifically on the topic of public protection through creative access to information. So I went ahead and did that, went down to Fort Worth, Texas for a few days, and got a chance to speak to those individuals who were in attendance. I talked a lot about a lot of the work the board has done, a lot of work the advisory committees do. I mentioned a lot of things that we have currently posted on our website and policies we revised with the idea of public protection. And I talked a lot about the board's YouTube channel as well and our efforts to get information out to the public. And I had a lot of good questions. Individuals asked me a lot of questions on how to set things up, and I was able to learn from a lot of different agencies as well. So that was a very positive and productive experience. And I'm happy that they invited me to attend, and it's a very good opportunity to learn different things about how to improve our overall processes as we continue to look at how we can license individuals quicker and make any adjustments here in our office too. So with that, I will go ahead and end my report, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
David, I was going to just mention that David is very good at notifying us with all the legislative activity, and hopefully we'll be able to continues to plan on sharing it with us. And wanted to say thank you, David, for that thorough report and update.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's a very busy time. I'm popping over to the Capitol quite a bit, but yeah, I'll continue to send out those reports and keep you updated.
I could imagine how busy of a time it is for you. Thank you, David, for that report. Before we move on, any questions from the committee? All right. The next item is new business under our agenda and the training for board advisory committee members. And I will turn that back over to David.
Thank you, Andrea. So some of you are brand new to the advisory committee, and some of you have served on the advisory committee before. This advisory committee is an interesting blend because we also have 3 board members who serve on the advisory committee. So at the January board meeting, I asked the board, how would you like to handle training for board members and advisory committee members? Last year, legal counsel for the board from the Attorney General's office provided an overall training, and it was about an hour and a half and very comprehensive. But I wanted to go ahead and let you know that I'll be taking over the training this year. So I'll be talking about some items for your attention. And I've managed to summarize it down. There's still a lot of material to cover. It's really important information, but I'll go ahead and do my best. I think it should be at least half, no longer than about half that amount of time. So in your packet, you received several documents, which I'll go ahead and talk about today. The first one I'll go ahead and highlight for your attention is an expectations of board members document. That's the title on the top of it. It's about maybe 5 pages long or so. So as I mentioned earlier, the board did go ahead and take a document previously called the board governance policy. And they went ahead and split that into 2 documents, an expectations of board members and then an advisory committee policy. And for some of you that are on the advisory committee, I want you to know that some of the phrasings will appear to apply only to board members. But just as a quick jump ahead, in the advisory committee policy, there is some language that says the same policies that apply to board members should also be expected to provide to advisory committee members. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. That seems specific to board members. Be thinking about a lot of these same principles as they apply to your work on the advisory committee. So under the expectations of board members, the BSRB is a state agency, and we are created in statute through the legislative action by the Kansas legislature. And so our number one guiding authority is through the statutes, which are the result of bills being passed by the legislature. We go ahead and create regulatory language and regulations to really flush out the details within our statutory authority. And then the third option in terms of those policies that we follow are anything that the board has chosen to adopt. And that's really where you will see this type of a document. It comes under that authority. So the first thing is just to clarify that if this document conflicts with or limits any federal or state statute or regulation, those types of regulations and statutes are going to have authority above anything you see in this document here. Second, the mission statement for the BSRB, in accordance with the intent of the Kansas legislature, is to protect and serve the consumers of mental health services and the professionals that offer them through the issuance of licenses, resolution of complaints, and the creation of appropriate regulations accomplished through efficiency, fairness, and respect to all those involved. The guiding principles of the BSRB is that persons in Kansas should expect that licensed mental health providers are qualified, competent, and professional. They should expect that the BSRB will be equitable and provide fair treatment in relation to licensing activities, disciplinary processes, and administrative regulations. The BSRB shall provide all services in a manner that is timely, cost-efficient, courteous, and competent. It should be guided by ethical principles, clear policies, progressive thinking, and strategic decision-making. And the BSRB shall respect the dignity and worth of all individuals. In terms of the services the BSRB provides, we should process license applications and license renewals in a timely manner. We should take disciplinary action when appropriate, provide timely information to the public, and maintain rules and regulations and statutes. On page 2, under the Code of Conduct, the board wanted to specifically highlight 3 items, even though there are a lot more responsibilities for board members. The first one is integrity. So board members should have no criminal or professional misconduct record or commit acts that would lead to investigations or complaints. Board members should possess sound moral principles. They should have the courage of conviction to withstand pressures to be swayed from the public protection agenda. They should be honest about personal agendas and leave them outside the boardroom. They should reveal any actual or perceived conflicts of interest and appropriately recuse themselves from decisions or actions in those areas of interest. They should not represent their personal opinion as that of the board, and they should be limited to 1 unexcused absence a year. Under the area of conflict of interest, members of the BSRB should guard against those conflicts of interest. They should have no financial benefit as a result of service to the BSRB, except sustenance and mileage, and board members do receive a real small amount per board meeting that they attend. A board member who may have a conflict of interest according to a stated criteria should refrain from voting on a matter. Board members should disclose any relationship with any other agency or individual involved with the BSRB and be excluded from matters involving any of those types of conflicts. Board members can serve as part of an organization working in any way with essentially, if you work with an organization that has a different goal than the BSRB, you need to make that known to the board chair. Board members should not accept any gifts or promotional items received as part of their affiliation with the agency for personal use and should not use the agency's name or agency information for personal gain. And under the area of confidentiality, so there are most items that we're going to discuss in our process of working with the advisory committees and the members of the board. Those items are not confidential. However, there are a handful that involve meetings that do remain confidential. One is any discussion that occurs during an executive session of the board or advisory committee, and also any discussion concerning actual or potential litigation. In terms of the composition of the board, by statute, the board is made up of 12 individuals. All are appointed by the governor. They serve one 4-year term and can be reappointed to serve a second 4-year term. So you can serve at most 8 years when you're appointed to these terms. In statute, it also does name that the members who make up those positions are 2 licensed psychologists, 2 individuals licensed to engage in the practice of social work, 1 professional counselor, 1 marriage and family therapist, 1 master's level psychologist, 1 licensed addiction counselor or licensed clinical addiction counselor, and 4 members of the board representing the general public. It also notes in statute that the board lacks the ability to add or remove board members. That is up to the sole discretion of the governor's office. And the 3 reasons it says in statute that board members can be removed is malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance. And those are very legal terms, but in a big picture sense, malfeasance means if you have a legal obligation to do something and you make an intentional action that is essentially in violation, you commit a bad action intentionally, that is malfeasance if it would be a violation of your legal duties. Misfeasance means you have a legal obligation to do something and you act recklessly or you make some great mistake that causes a problem with your legal responsibility. That would be misfeasance. And then nonfeasance is when you have a legal responsibility to do something and you just do not act. That's more or less nonfeasance. That's kind of a broad definition of those 3 terms, but the statute says those are the grounds by which board members can be removed from the board. And again, the board does not have the authority to add or remove members. It's all up to the governor's office and the governor's discretion. In terms of meeting of the board meetings, at least the full meetings of the board, shall take place every other month on the 2nd Monday of the month. The board can determine to meet more frequently, especially in the spring during the legislative session if there are bills that come up. Sometimes they come up with a very short period of time before those hearings. And so if that doesn't happen, I will let the board know, and then we'll have a real quick board meeting, and then I'll summarize those bills that have come up and give the board an opportunity to ask me to introduce legislation on behalf of the board. The document describes what items should be on the full board meeting agenda, and then it says the responsibilities of the chair, followed by the responsibilities of the vice chair. And then on page 4, there's also a note about emergency executive sessions or succession should something happen to the chair of the board. Additionally, there is some information here about the board and the executive director relationship. And I'll go ahead and summarize this information here. I want to highlight it so you will know a little bit more about my responsibility and my connection to the BSRB. It says the executive director will communicate any personnel matters that should be addressed by the board to the chair of the board. And the chair of the board will present those board-related issues to the board. The executive director will also communicate to the staff the board's wishes, intentions, and policies. In terms of delegation to the executive director shall be the administrative head of the organization, serving at all times under the board. The executive director will be responsible for implementing and executing the policies and activities approved by the board. He shall assist in the development of the overall program and shall recommend policies and activities for consideration by the board. The executive director shall have sole authority to employ, eliminate, and fix the duties and salaries of other employees or independent contractors of the organization, subject to policies, regulations, and limitations approved by the state of Kansas. And just to let you know, we went through the hiring process just recently for our administrative assistant. Any individuals we wish to hire and also the amount we wish to pay them does get reviewed by the governor's office, and the governor's office does have the ability to deny us the ability to hire a specific person or deny us the ability to pay the person a specific amount. So there is still a check on that from the governor's office. Under the executive expectations, the executive director will keep the board advised of Bsrb activities by issuing a report to the board at each full meeting, which summarizes pertinent information. And the executive director will also prepare the agenda for board meetings in consultation with the board chair. On page 5, the executive director shall prepare the agenda in consultation with the board chair for the annual planning meeting of the board that happens in September. And then there's a note here about monitoring the executive director's performance. The board shall, when necessary, utilize executive session to discuss issues concerning the executive director. The board shall also formally evaluate the performance of the executive director each calendar year and on an annual basis thereafter, with emphasis on whether set outcomes are attained. And then I also want to mention here, we talk a lot about the licensing responsibilities of the office, but there are two main sub-programs. There's the licensing side, and there's also the investigation and discipline side. And in terms of the investigation of complaints and the discipline, that is handled by a subsection of the board. That group is called the Complaint Review Committee. And the CRC is made up of 5 board members. There is a separate policy on the investigation and complaint process. And if you want more information on that, you can go to the board's website under the policies section and you can review that document. In that document, it notes that the 5 board members who make up the CRC are 1 licensed psychologist, 1 social worker, 2 public members, and then 1 other individual representing one of the specified professions there in that policy. There's also a policy on the board's website about what information is posted to the board's website concerning disciplinary actions of professionals. And the CRC meets the same month as advisory committees, and it meets every other month, similar to the board or the advisory committees. The next document I'll reference is a 2-page document, and it is called the Advisory Committee Policy. So the Advisory Committee Policy is also the branch off of the former board governance policy. It is now a standalone policy involving advisory committees. And that document describes the advisory committees being created by the board for the purpose of supporting the board and carrying out its mission to protect the public. Members serve at the pleasure of the board, and actions pertaining to informing, licensing, and disciplining of those persons regulated by the board are the methods for accomplishing that mission. It talks about the advisory committees fulfilling their purpose by addressing issues referred to it by the board through the advisory committee chair or through the executive director. And then an advisory committee may suggest issues it believes the board should consider by referring those through the chair of the advisory committee. When the latter occurs, it talks about the actions the board can take in response to a recommendation from the advisory committee. The structure of the committee is specified there in the next section. The chairs of advisory committees will be members of the board. If the profession is represented on the board, the chair of the advisory committee will be a board member licensed in the discipline of the committee and appointed by the governor to represent that discipline on the board. Any other board members appointed by the governor to represent that discipline on the board will serve as a member of that advisory committee. And what that means is the current makeup of the board has 2 licensed psychologists. So they're both members of that advisory committee. And similar in the social work advisory committee, there are 2 social workers on the board, and both of them sit on the advisory committee. And then it notes there will also be a public member on each of the advisory committees. There will be a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 10 additional members appointed to each of the advisory committees. It talks about the executive director being a non-voting ex officio member of the advisory committees, the assistant director or licensing manager being encouraged to attend, and also that the assistant attorney general representing the board should attend the meetings when their attendance is requested. And Angie, I saw your hand up. Did you have a question on the advisory committee policy?
Yes.
Okay.
When you are looking at the process section and you're looking at the numbered 1, 2, and 3, it's kind of confusing. Is it the advisory committee can agree the issue needs to be addressed by the board level? It's like the board and the board, so it's kind of confusing. So I just wanted to ask that question.
So when it's talking about the responses the board can have to the advisory committees, that's what you're talking about? Yeah, so yeah, when a recommendation is forwarded from the advisory committee to the board will review that, because essentially what happens at every board meeting is each of the chairs of the advisory committee provides an update to the board about the work of the advisory committee. And in response to hearing that recommendation or that request, the board can either agree the issue needs to be addressed at the board level. The board can agree the issue should be addressed and refer the matter to the appropriate person or committee for additional information, review, analysis that will then be brought back to the board, or the board can decide not to address the issue. So board has some discretion, or it could have a subcommittee or have an expert or someone like that it might get some clarification from, or it can say, we understand that is the recommendation or the request of the advisory committee, and we're going to go ahead and continue to work on this at the board level. So.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understood it. Thank you.
You're welcome. In terms of advisory committees, members are appointed to 2-year terms, and members can be reappointed by the chair of the BSRB for up to 4 terms. So you can serve the same length of time as a board member. It's just distributed a little bit differently. Appointments to the committee should be staggered to avoid having too many members of the advisory committee reach their maximum length of service at the same time. And also it notes here the policies and procedures under which the BSRB board members are expected to operate will also apply to the advisory committee members. And then it clarifies here, it mentions the chair appoints members to the advisory committee, and the chair of the BSRB can also remove members from the advisory committee. In terms of the length of service, I know in the past, some of the advisory committee terms have kind of blended together. But with this new policy, what we'll be doing is we'll be bringing to the chair of the board lists of individuals who wish to continue to serve on the advisory committees, and then they will be coming up for reappointment, and then the chair will just have to reappoint those individuals to the advisory committee when that comes due. And usually we go off of the state fiscal year, and the state fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th of the following year. There's a section here that talks about selection of members to the advisory committees. And it notes that when individuals are, so in terms of selecting members to the advisory committee, that is largely a 2-part process. One, the individuals are asked to go ahead and submit their resumes or cover letters or interest in serving on the advisory committee, and that's all collected. And then the advisory committee reviews all that information and makes recommendations on who should be added to the advisory committee. And it says in here, when reviewing nominees, the committee should work to ensure there is diverse representation, including but not limited to geographic setting, gender, culture, and ethnicity, and that members should provide representation of the levels of licensing for that discipline, and also those members who should be selected from among the public and private practitioners and also educators. In terms of the actual mechanics for reaching recommendations and then providing those to the chair of the board for review, that's on page 2. It does indicate that the recommendations of the advisory committee are provided to the board chair, and the board chair has the opportunity to collect additional input. And then the actual members become advisory committee members when they are named by the chair of the board at a board meeting. So that when you received a little certificate from me that indicated when your term started, the date of that was likely the date of the board meeting where the chair of the board went ahead and named you on the advisory committee. And then the document talks a little bit about the executive director informing members of the advisory committee after the board has taken action at the board meeting. The next document is another short document. It's a 2-page document called Guidelines for Public Attendees at Meetings. And I referenced this document a little earlier. I just wanted to talk about it in a little more detail. This is posted on the board's website under our policies section. And it notes that the BSRB and subcommittees of the BSRB, such as advisory committees, fall under the Kansas Open Meeting Act for most of our meetings, which are open to the public. It notes that under the COMA, it does not require that there be public comment provided to individuals, but as part of our public protection mission, the agency values the receipt of information and input from members of the public. And it notes to ensure that all individuals are treated in consistent and respectful manner. The agency has created this guidance document to provide general procedures for individuals attending board meetings and advisory committee meetings, as well as general guidance on topics relevant for public comment at these meetings. It provides some general etiquette and guidance for in-person meetings when we are able to have those. Currently, under the governor's direction, we are asked not to have in-person meetings due to some of the issues related to the pandemic. But we are hopeful that in the future we'll be able to have in-person meetings sooner rather than later. There's also a note here about virtual meetings, and it provides some information about the etiquette and the process to be followed when we have meetings over Zoom. It notes some general guidance for attendees of many meetings, such as avoiding disruptions and things like cell phone etiquette. On page 2, there is some information in terms of the procedure for providing public comment. And it notes that the chair of the board and chair of the advisory committees will determine whether public comment will be allowed at each meeting. If time for public comment is permitted, the chair will have authority to determine the amount of time available for public comment, and that any individuals wishing to provide public comment are to forward those requests to me, and then I will contact the chairs and coordinate that. When individuals provide public comment, they're not required to submit something in writing, but we do encourage that so that the board and the advisory committees will be more knowledgeable about the subject matter going into the meeting so that they can be more able to interact and ask questions if that is part of the public comment time. Though it does note here that at the conclusion of the public comment, the chair may allow time for questions or may move to the next item on the agenda. Sometimes our agendas for meetings are very packed, so there may not be a whole lot of time for that. But that is the option for the chair. They can go ahead and move forward right after public comment, or they can engage in some discussion and questions afterwards. And then I do want to call your attention to the bottom of that second page, and that is the section I talked about briefly earlier, topics relevant for public comment. And it talks about, as a state agency created by the Kansas legislature, we're governed by statutes and regulations, and information presented to the board or advisory committees should be relevant to those statutes or regulations governing the agency. The chair reserves the right to limit testimony that is in the judgment of the chair, not relevant to matters germane to the board or advisory committees. And then it notes some common examples of past public comment topics, including requested changes to the statutes or regulations relating to qualifications for licensure, fees, continuing education, or unprofessional conduct. It also notes here that the Bsrb highly values receipt of information that a licensee may have violated the statutes or regulations for professional conduct. However, to ensure that we maintain a consistent approach in how we collect that information, review it, and that we're being fair to both the person who provides that and also to the licensee, we outline the procedure here for them and where they can go on our website to fill out these complaints or report of alleged violation forms. And noting that we do definitely want to receive this information, but we have to do some of this information has to be collected in a different way, so it wouldn't be the best topic and wouldn't really be appropriate for public comment. So that document is also posted to the board's website. Any questions about those documents before I move to the document provided by legal counsel for the board? Okay, if not, I'll go ahead and move to the document we received last year. This document has a heading Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board and Advisory Committee Members Orientation. And it was from Janet Arndt, who was Assistant Attorney General for the Attorney General's office. She was our primary legal representative from that office. We contract for legal services through the Attorney General's office, and each year one of them acts as a primary person to assist us. And so in this document, I'm going to go ahead and talk about a few of the different items, and please let me know if you do have questions as we get into some of this subject matter. The state of Kansas regulates professions, and each of the professions is regulated by a licensing board or commission, and it is created by the Kansas legislature for the purpose of ensuring that licensed professionals are competent and do not pose a risk to the public. Professional licensing board is created by enabling legislation, which establishes the board's form, mission, powers, functions, tools of implementation, and enforcement abilities. It does note here that in addition to statutes specific to the board's authority is also limited by constitutional protection, equal protection, and due process rights, which prohibit a board from acting in a manner which results in disparate or inconsistent treatment of persons that are similarly situated. It provides as an example, the licensing board may not impose more severe discipline on male licensees solely because of their gender, or a licensing board may not revoke a license simply because the board does not like that particular person. The Kansas legislature created the BSRB, and they do retain control over our agency in several ways. First, we are a statutory board, and we were created because the legislature passed a law authorizing our creation. So one thing the legislature could do is they could decide to repeal the enabling legislation, which would eliminate the board. Second, the legislature could pass legislation that would change the makeup, scope, or the powers of the board. And also, each year, I mentioned our agency's budget has to be approved by the House and the Senate. We don't receive any money directly from the state of Kansas. We actually operate off of fee funds, what we call them. We collect fees, licensure fees from applicants, and then we use that money for most of our expenditures over the course of the year. By statute, fee-funded agencies have to contribute 10% of all revenue we collect back to the state general fund. So last year, we turned over to the state about $78,000 that we had collected in revenue, and by statute, we have to give that back to the state from the state general fund. The remaining expenditures that we operate with come from any revenue that comes in and also any balance in our agency's fee fund. However, the legislature passes an appropriations bill each year, which identifies a limitation, and you are not able to spend above that fee fund limit. So even if we had money in the bank and we were receiving revenue, if the legislature passed an appropriations bill that zeroed out our revenue or our expenditures for the year, we could have money in the bank, but we wouldn't be able to spend it. So we do still have, legislature still has control because of the purse strings. There's also some language that talks about the wording of our statutes. There are some statutes that says the board shall do X, Y, Z. And in that case, that means the board has to do that. There's also some language that uses the word may. And when the statutes use the word may, it generally means that the board is supposed to consider the facts of that case and decide on an outcome that is fair, supported by facts, and consistent with the public interest, and complies with the language of the applicable statutes and regulations. The general purpose, whether explicit or implied, of a licensing board is to secure for the people of Kansas the services of competent, trustworthy practitioners, and to protect the public against unprofessional, unauthorized, and unqualified practitioners. The purpose of a licensing board is not to promote or protect a profession as a whole. Those functions typically lie with a private professional association. A licensing board accomplishes its purpose through licensing applications and applicants who meet established eligibility qualifications, generally education, experience, and an examination, and through the disciplinary process by which a license must be conditioned, limited, revoked, suspended, or otherwise sanctioned for a violation of a statute or regulation. In terms of the functions of a licensing board, the board is granted or delegated powers, which kind of parallel the three branches of government. We do receive some quasi-executive authority, and that is through our Enabling Act. We are required to follow the Open Meeting Act, and a lot of our records are subject to the Kansas Open Records Act to ensure that the public's business is conducted openly. Secondly, we have a quasi-judicial authority, and that is that our Enabling Act allows us to hold quasi-judicial hearings to make finding of fact and conclusions of law when determining whether the facts have proven a violation of the law has occurred. Those provisions under the Complaint Review Committee meetings are held not in an open meeting, but under the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, which we'll talk about in a little more detail later. And then we have a quasi-legislative authority, and that largely has to do with our ability to adopt regulations in order to implement or interpret the Enabling Act with more detailed or specific requirements. In terms of understanding what a statute is and a regulation and policies a little bit more, you'll find that on page 3 of that document. So a regulatory board implements and enforces statutes and regulations, and at all times operates accordingly to internal policies. In order to be effective, board members need to understand the differences between statutes, regulations, and policies. Statutes are laws passed by the Kansas legislature through authority derived from the Kansas Constitution and subsequently signed by the governor. Statutes generally become effective on July 1st of that session year, but can become effective if a different date is specified in the legislation. For example, recently there was a multi-state compact called SIPAC. It was for licensed psychologists, and it had an implementation date of January 1st of 2022. There's also a way to have something become effective if it's in the Kansas Register. The Kansas Register is a bi-weekly publication from the Secretary of State's office. And so if someone wanted something to go into effect earlier than the statute book publication, they would put it in the register. Regulations, as they differ from statutes, is that a regulation is adopted by the board to further implement or carry out the purpose of a particular statute. The board's authority to adopt regulation is defined by the statute. On page 4, you will see that when considering whether to recommend a change in regulation, it says you should look at the following factors. 1, is there a need for the regulation? 2, determine the statutory authority to adopt the regulation. 3, look at the procedure to adopt the regulation. And then on page 6, differing from statutes and regulations, there's some information there about policies and guidance documents. So policies may be adopted by the board only to guide its internal operations. And we mentioned a few of those earlier, and those are posted to the board's website. Guidance documents are documents that state a board's current approach to or interpretation of law, or general statements of policy that describe how and when the board will exercise discretionary functions. Guidance documents must be published on the agency's website, and those ones I referenced earlier are posted as well. On page 6, there's a section that talks about how to be effective as a board member, but I think you should also apply this to how to be effective as an advisory committee member. The number one thing is to read through the board statutes. And since this is the Social Work Advisory Committee, good idea to go ahead and go to the board's website and read through the social work statutes. Second, it would be to read through the regulations for the social work profession. Be on the alert for agency policies and internal procedures that are inconsistent with or conflict with the board statutes and regulations, or which affect requirements for applicants or licensees. So as you go through that process, if you see something and you believe that there may be a policy that ends with something that's in statute or regulation, please let us know. And then we can review that to see if there is a conflict or maybe there's maybe an exception. Ensure that the decisions are within the authority granted. Be willing to initiate action to amend statutes or modify regulations. Remember that the purpose of imposing discipline against licensees is to encourage compliance with the law and to protect the public. And always be mindful that the role of the board is to protect the public and not the licensee. On page 7, there's some information there about conflicts of interest. And we've talked a little bit about conflicts of interest. There's a definition there that any interest, financial or otherwise, direct or indirect, or engaging in any business or transaction or professional activity or incurring any obligation of any nature that is in substantial conflict with the proper discharge of the board member's duties in the public interest, that would be a conflict of interest. And it asks here that board members must make public and recuse themselves from any conflict of interest that exists to ensure the integrity of the board and all its decisions. It notes here some common types of conflicts of interest, such as personal conflicts, personal gain, perhaps a bias, or the effect of a personal relationship. And under the umbrella of conflicts of interest, we understand there might be some times where it's a gray area for you and you're wondering whether something is a conflict, it's a big enough conflict for you to recuse yourself. We would ask that you err on the side of going ahead and recusing yourself from a vote, just to let us know, even if it means that we might have to delay a vote on an action, it's better to go ahead and do that at the beginning than to regret not having done that and then have to clean it up afterwards. So if you believe there may be a conflict of interest, just go ahead and recuse yourself from that vote, and then other members will be able to take that action. On page 8, under confidentiality, as I mentioned before, most items we discuss are not going to be confidential, but there are a handful of things that it's really important that you understand some of the rules of confidentiality. At all times, the board members should conform to the rules of confidentiality and dealing outside the boardroom. Protected information obtained in the capacity of board membership or advisory committee membership must remain confidential during and after board membership. Termination of membership does not dissolve the member from that responsibility. So I mentioned before that any discussions in an executive session of the board or the advisory committees, that information is confidential. Frequently, that could be consultation with the attorney from the board. It could be discussions about any potential litigation, or it could be a matter involving a personnel matter. So those all would fall under those topics that would be confidential. Additionally, more for board members than for advisory committee members, but sometimes there are decisions where an individual has not been granted licensure and they appeal that decision, and there was a hearing. And so after the hearing, there is a confidential session with the board members and legal counsel for the board. And during those deliberations, anything that's discussed would also remain confidential. On page 9, there's a section there about ex-parte communications. I'm not going to get into a lot of the detail on that because it mostly involves issues related to hearings. But the general concept is that in certain cases, we need to make sure we follow appropriate guidelines for those hearings in an effort to promote fairness, so that if there's an individual who is appealing a decision, we have to make sure that legal counsel for the board and that individual are included on the same emails, and that the board receives information about a licensure case at the same time from both parties to assure the fairness. If you have questions about that, let me know, but I'll let you go ahead and read the rest of that section. At the bottom of page 9, there's some information there about professional activities. So a board member may hold an office in a professional or trade association of the regulated profession, but may not lobby for or cast votes regarding a matter that would impact the professional association or the board member's office in that association. The board member may not use his or her position on the board to further the interest of the professional association or his or her office in that association. And it notes here that board members may attend professional conferences and social events, but they must be mindful of open meeting rules and conflicts of interest. And if a majority of the members of the board or advisory committee are present, just make sure you don't discuss business or affairs of the board to avoid triggering a meeting under the coma. On page 10, under other conduct, board members should not represent themselves as a spokesperson for the board unless authorized by a vote of the board to speak on the board's behalf. If a board member is asked to give the board's position on an issue and the board has not authorized that member to do so, the board member must decline to comment or make clear that any opinions expressed are those of him or herself alone and not the board. And so for you, in your role as an advisory committee, and some of you for your role as a board member, individuals from the public might ask you, well, how would the board feel about this? Or what would the board do if we were to do this? And it's really important for you not to speak on behalf of the board or the advisory committee unless the board has voted to do that. The board votes sometimes to delegate to me the ability to speak for the board in regards to presenting testimony and answering questions from committee. But I'm always very careful to try to limit myself to what the board has specifically said or actions the board has taken. But you just need to be aware not to represent your own views or opinions as that of the board. On page 10, there's some information there about the Kansas Open Meeting Act. Under the coma, it allows the public to observe governmental entities making decisions. And in essence, meetings shall be open to the public because a representative government is dependent upon an informed electorate. So board meetings and advisory committee meetings in general fall under coma and are open. And there are some that are not, but we'll talk about those here in a little bit. In terms of making sure that you avoid an issue with the Kansas Open Meeting Act, a meeting is defined as any gathering or assembling of persons through the use of a telephone or any medium for interactive communication for the majority of the members of an agency or public body and for the purposes of discussing the business or affairs of the public body or agency. It does indicate that it could be in person or it could be over something like phone or Zoom. And you just have to watch out that you don't have the majority of members of the committee discussing items that would be relevant to their role as being a board member and advisory committee member. And it doesn't have to be a specific action like voting. A discussion would be something that would also trigger the open meetings rules here. And if you have any questions about what might qualify for that, just let me know. One thing to be careful on is email communication. So as a staff member working for a state agency, I'm allowed to operate by some different rules. And so I will send out information and I can communicate with any of you. So if you ever have questions, don't hesitate to come to me with a question. I'm happy to answer you. But it does mean that you're not able to send emails back and forth outside of a meeting for communications because those emails are not really open to the public. And so you have to be careful about that. Additionally, you have to watch out for something called chain communication. So you may send an email out to 2 members and you may say, okay, well now we're okay because we didn't involve the majority of the committee. But if those 2 members share that information with other members and it continues to spread until it connects with the majority of the committee members, then you would be involving the majority of the committee on a discussion outside of a meeting. And so it would be a violation of COMA. So you just need to make sure that as much as possible, save your group discussions for these advisory committee meetings to have these. And like I said, feel free to email me with any questions on that, or, and if it's just talking with one person, that usually is fine. And so if you do have a question for, let's say, the chair of the committee, or you want to talk about something in preparation for the advisory committee meeting, that's usually okay. You just want to make sure that it doesn't involve the majority of the committee. In terms of the procedures, making sure we follow COMA, the board office takes care of a lot of those. We do send email notice of meetings. We post them on our website. We use the public square. So we also broadcast this meeting in large part to make sure that it is open to the public. As I mentioned earlier, the governor's office has given us direction not to have in-person meetings currently due to the pandemic. So we're operating in different ways to ensure public access to meetings. And for the most part, it's been received very positively. But just go ahead and read through that. If you have questions about anything else that I didn't cover specifically in there, just go ahead and let me know. On page 12, if there's any issues with the COMA, those are investigated by the Attorney General's office, and they are a civil matter, not a criminal matter. On page 13, there's some information there about the Kansas Open Records Act. In general, any of the records that we receive, most of them could be subject to a request under the Kansas Open Records Act. There might be certain information that will be confidential, something like a social security number, or maybe certain address information for someone. But in general, a lot of those communications and a lot of those records would potentially be open to a request. So what I ask advisory committee members and board members to be thinking about is, be cautious of the way that you phrase things and what you say in those emails, because you may think, well, this was a communication just intended for this one person, but it is a record, and things like text messages can be records. And just think about how that would appear if those came up later at a hearing or will be introduced, in the news. Something to think about. And so just be mindful of the way that you communicate and what you say in those records and what actually could be a record. It doesn't have to be a specific file. A lot of those other things people may not think of as records are actually records under this context.
David?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
This is Jane. I am interested in knowing, when you said chain on the COMA, I have never heard that term before, and I'm pretty familiar with the COMA. Is that in this information?
Legal counsel talked about it last year, so I brought it up. I'm not sure if it's specifically referenced in here.
Okay. If not, I'll just research it because I'd like to have more information on it. So I'll just research it myself.
Yeah.
But thank you.
You're welcome. I've heard that with emails that are forwarded to different members and then continue to be forwarded on. I've also heard it in the context by, let's say that someone contacts each of the board members or advisory committee members separately. You might receive an email specifically from one person and you think, oh, well, it's just one person. I can go ahead and respond back to that person.
Right. It makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. So I didn't see it in there, and I just was wondering if it was stated in there, and I just was missing it. So
sure. And I guess this is a good time to point out too, if you do receive communications from the public, it is always a good idea to go ahead and loop me in on those communications. Because if someone were to request records, if they're on our server, we can say, well, any records relating to Bsrb activities in here, we can go ahead and provide those records. And so as much as possible, when there's items involving your work with the Bsrb, either as a board member or advisory committee member, just go ahead and loop the office in so we can assist you, but also so we make sure that there's not a lot of communications going on outside of, the agencies. It just keeps the records a lot cleaner and makes sure that you're not running into any issues with those records. On page 15, it talks about that the Attorney General basically would investigate any issues with the Kansas Open Records Act. And we have a procedure here specifically for how to deal with open records requests, and that is posted on our website as well. On page 16, there's some information there about the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, or CAPA. One thing specific to board members, we have a special board meeting once a month at the end of the month to resolve any cases that the board specifically has to review involving specific licensure candidates. So in general, our procedures in dealing with all licensees really wouldn't be confidential. But when we're examining the materials for one person, and a decision has not been made on their license application yet, that is something that would fall under this Kansas Administrative Procedures Act. And under CAPA, on the following pages, it notes that it has to be in statute that you would follow the CAPA. But then those hearings are not open to the public. It's an opportunity for board and staff to discuss those issues and for the board to get legal consultation as well, and then reach a decision on licensure for some of those individuals. Most things don't fall under the Kansas Open Administrative Procedures Act, but the other one that does fall under that is in work of the Complaint Review Committee when they are investigating discipline and discussions. Those also are in a private session as they involve current licensees under an active investigation. The following information is just good information on CAPA, so you're welcome to read that as your leisure. But there's one other item I wanted to point out just to conclude the training, and that is on page 21. On the bottom of page 21 is a section that talks a little bit about the Kansas Tort Claims Act. And the Kansas Tort Claims Act, it generally governs the liability of the state of Kansas and its agencies and employees. And so an employee includes a member of a board or committee of a governmental entity, including elected or appointed officials and persons acting on behalf of or in service of a governmental entity in any official capacity, whether with or without compensation. So as I understand it, the Kansas Tort Claims Act does extend to board members, but I don't believe it extends to advisory committee members. And the basic essence of the Kansas Tort Claims Act is that vicarious liability for any actionable wrongful act or omission of government agent employees within the course and scope of their employment, subject to affirmative grants of immunity that may exist on a case-by-case basis. So if you are sued for an act that occurred within the scope of your duties as a board member, you are entitled to have the Attorney General's office defend you at no cost. And that is a limited guarantee. As I mentioned, it only applies to board members, and in talking with the Attorney General's office, there may be reasons why they would not be able to assist you with that, but there are some processes on page 22 in which you need to request for them to represent you and provide services to you, and you have to do so within a certain period of time. But there is a protection for board members, and that some of the decisions they make under their responsibilities as an employee of the state could entitle them to protection under the Attorney General's office because of that work. So I realize we covered a lot of material here and a lot of ground. Some of it I think is just helpful to hear. Some of it is more going to relate to board member responsibilities than to advisory committee member responsibilities. But I also think, there have been a number of members of advisory committees who have later gone on to become board members. And I also feel it's important for you to understand the role that you play on the advisory committee and the bigger picture of understanding the role the board plays and understanding the role that I play and understanding the role the rest of the Bsrb office here plays as well. So hopefully this put some things in context and also provided a few things that you could continue to research. And if you do have questions, like I said a few times, you're always welcome to reach out to me. If there's something that just seems a little unclear or something you would like some additional information on, let me know. I'm happy to help. And also Leslie Allen, she's Assistant Director and Licensing Manager for the board. If you haven't had an opportunity to talk to Leslie, she's also a great resource here at the office. I have come up on working with the Bsrb just a little over a year now. I started back in November of 2020. So I've been with the agency for a year and a few months, but I'm still a little early on, and we're still evaluating some of the current policies of the office and looking at changes. Leslie has been with the office for over 20 years and has seen a lot of the changes over the years for the professions, and is a great source of information in terms of the statutes and the regulations And she is great in terms of the licensing requirements and the history of the agency. And so she's been a big help to me. And I know if you have questions, she would also be a great resource for you as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop and see if there's any questions involving any of the training materials.
Thank you, David, for that overview. Any of the committee members have any questions for David? It was a lot to soak in.
This is not a question, Andrea, but if it's helpful to new new advisory members, I continue to learn. I mean, it's every day something new, and so it's a bit overwhelming at first, but every year gets better.
I would agree, Carolyn. Learning something each time.
I guess one of my questions would be, and especially with having new board members on, if the Kansas Tort Claims Act does not support advisory council, what would we look at for a possibility of an insurance, because we couldn't get malpractice insurance for being on a board like this. So what is it that we would look at to be on a board and to have protection if we were to have someone that was upset with a decision that was made based on advisory council decision in a logistical world that we live in?
It's a very good question. I will research that and bring it back. I do know that it was talked about last year at the training that Vicarious Liability Act would apply to board members, but not advisory committee members. If I ever do get questions from individuals who may, attend a meeting or have a question about something the advisory committee did, one thing I think is helpful, and I do my best to remind people of this, is that the work of the advisory committee, the strongest action they can take is a recommendation. Ultimately, any of the official decisions are up to the board, and the board is the one that has the authority to actually make the decisions on that. So the advisory committees could have discussions, but they really don't have the power based on our current structure to really, do a lot of the specific changes. Even when it comes to adding members to the advisory committee, the advisory committee went through that process and identified candidates, but the advisory committee didn't add those candidates. They still were recommendations to be passed to the chair of the board, and it was the chair of the board that added those people, but the chair of the board could have made a different decision. And there are recommendations that are sometimes forwarded to the board, and the board sometimes does those recommendations, and sometimes they do something very different. So, I think it's helpful to put it in that context. When people maybe might have some ideas about something an advisory committee member said, and I don't want to say anything in one way or another about what's happened before my time, because I've only really been with the agency for a little over a year, but I do think it's helpful to put that in context in terms of the power of the advisory committees. But I'll be happy to look into that and talk to our legal counsel and just kind of bring back some information to you guys next meeting.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Jane. That was a great question. Any other questions that come up? All right, thank you. We'll move on to the next agenda item, which is review of responses to social work survey from December of 2021. And David, I will hand it over to you.
Great. So in the fall, the advisory committee discussed having a survey for licensees and collecting information on a number of different topics. And I believe the last survey of social workers that the Bsrb had done was back in 2015. And so there was some question about what questions to ask and how to go about and do this survey, because there are currently, I think, between 7,000 and 8,000 currently licensed social workers. So it's a very big group to poll. But we went ahead and used SurveyMonkey and submitted a list of questions and had to use certain parameters to make sure that we could send it out to everyone. but I'll go ahead and share my screen. I've got the report pulled up here. Okay, can you see my screen with the report? Great.
Yes.
Yes.
So in your packet, you should have received one of your documents as a report from the survey, a summary of what responses that we received back. And so kind of the information that I just shared, this was a topic that was discussed first, at least last year, in the May meeting of the Social Work Advisory Committee. And there was a request for some questions to be drafted and modified. And a couple of the topics looking at was supervision, maybe the topic of board approved clinical supervisors and other topics relevant to the social work profession. And then at the October 19th meeting, I brought back some draft questions for the committee to review. And there was a request there to have the survey collect both qualitative and quantitative data. And there was also some request to make sure that we had a broad range of practitioners, including those that lived in urban, rural, and also frontier areas of the state of Kansas. And so we went ahead and sent this out in December. As I mentioned, there were between 7,000 and 8,000 individuals who held a permanent license under the Bsrb. We used SurveyMonkey. We went ahead and opened the survey on Thursday, December 16th, 2021, and sent out a message to all social workers that it was open and that it would close at 5 o'clock on Monday, December 20th. Over the time period, we had 1,087 social workers complete at least part of the survey, and we've summarized their responses on the following pages. To ensure that we received a good sample of information from a broad range of practitioners, we asked, in what county do you practice social work? And this was a text box that was open, so we received quite a few different responses. We went ahead and tried to group some of the counties. There are, I believe, 105 counties in Kansas. And so if there were any difference in how those counties were described, we didn't try to combine those answers. But if it was clearly just one, we went ahead and summarized those. I think what this question is helpful for is that if there's a county that you specifically were curious if someone responded to the survey and they were from that county, you might find some good information here about if someone did. And additionally, it also reflects, we have a number of individuals who hold a license and they live out of state. So we were intending to know what counties they practice in Kansas, but some indicated some counties outside of Kansas. And some mentioned they work in multiple counties, which is also helpful too. So, so that's information that you can review in terms of the different counties and the distribution of those respondents. The second question said, do you practice in a predominantly urban area, rural area, or frontier area? I went ahead and checked the most recent census data for the state of Kansas, and I believe in 2020, how it appeared was that the state of Kansas had somewhere between 58% and 60% that lived in urban areas. And so I believe the percentage of people who responded to the survey, it's slightly above what the census made it appear, but I think it's still pretty close. So I think it is pretty close to being an accurate representation of the state of Kansas. And as you can see, there were 1,073 individuals who answered this question. So in terms of the urban versus rural, and then a small number of frontier, and then a few did not want to answer or were unsure. The next question was, do you provide LSCSW clinical supervision to practitioners in Kansas? And individuals who responded yes on this, there were 148 of them. Question number 4 said, if you answered yes, that you do, of those individuals who said yes, how many Kansas practitioners do you generally provide supervision to during the same time period? And then it said, if you answered no, go ahead and skip the question. So there were 161 individuals who responded to this question. The most popular answer was 1, although the second most popular was 2 individuals. There are some individuals who provide supervision to a lot of individuals in Kansas. Question 5, again, was if you answered yes on question 3, when you first provided clinical level supervision to practitioners, what training had you received prior to providing supervision? And so the range on this was pretty broad in terms of what training they had received prior to providing that supervision, but we left this as a text box so individuals were able to provide a lot of different responses here. And for the purpose of time, I'll just go ahead and jump to the next question. But this report is posted on our website for any individuals who did want to go back and review the report in greater detail. Question 6 said, if you hold an LSCSW license, when you received clinical supervision, did you encounter any issues relating to the quality of supervision? And then it said, please explain. And so 453 individuals responded to this question. And did you encounter any issues relating to the quality of supervision? The most popular answer was no. And so we did group 285 individuals. And then did you encounter any issues? 5 individuals said yes. And then if there were individuals who answered no, comma, with a reason, we didn't group those. Those are all here. The same if there are any that said yes, comma, and then they said the reason for that. So as much as possible, we wanted to not try to summarize any of the information we thought could be helpful if any individuals want to review this for thoughts on future changes or recommendations. Question 7 said, should LSCSWs providing clinical supervision be board-approved supervisors? And on this, 1,045 individuals answered the questions. 43.9% said yes, 20% said no, and then 34% said they were unsure. We didn't give any real specifics in terms of providing an actual policy on this question. It was more of a, are you supportive of there being a requirement for board-approved supervisors? And that's the breakout that we received. On question 8, it said, how many hours of continuing education and supervisory training should be required to become a board-approved clinical supervisor? And then we thought we would clarify if those hours could count within the necessary number of hours that are required to renew a license. And on this, we got a broad range of responses in terms of the one-time hours you would need to become a board-approved clinical supervisor. Question 9 said, how many hours of continuing education and supervisory training should be required each renewal period to maintain board-approved clinical supervisor status? And then again, we noted making sure that they did not think that was something above the 40 hours that were required as part of the license renewal period. So how many hours should be required each renewal period to maintain that board-approved clinical supervisor status? And then we gave people a couple answers here in terms of 1 to 3, 4 to 6, unsure, 0. So you can see the responses broken out here as well. And then question 10, we said, should social workers be required to take 3 hours of continuing education in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion every 2-year license renewal period, if those hours could be part of the 40 hours required for each license renewal period? And 60% of respondents said yes, 30% of respondents said no, and then about 8% said that they were unsure. And as I mentioned, this report is on the BSRB website under the materials for this meeting in case any individuals would like to receive a copy of it and go through the information here. But I thought it was helpful for a lot of those individuals to provide a lot of the information, especially in those open fields. So we do plan to go back and review some of their responses in greater detail.
Well, thank you, David, for providing that overview. What is the committee's initial thoughts?
I was really excited to see this, and I was encouraged too. I would like to see something come from it, especially 8 and 9. Even if we looked at throwing out, if we looked at the numbers that show, like, I'll just say, like, if we went to question 8 and 9 is what I'm looking at, and even the IDEA number. And if we looked at the 2 numbers on 8, that is 4 to 6 hours, and the 10 to 12, because you're looking at 444 respondents right there. I throw unsure out because they can't make a decision. So I personally, I throw that out, but I'm just going to use this for an example. You have the 4 to 6 hours, you have the 10 to 12. I throw the low out and I throw the high number out, and you average the other 2 numbers. You're looking at 6 to 10, and you average that number. You have an 8-hour day. That's a perfect training day. And the same as the question number 9. You throw your low number out, you throw your high number out, you look continuing ed for supervisory training, and you're looking at 3 to 4 hours. That's pretty much normal in your training hours. Again, as a trainer, that's what we see when we go to seek training hours, 3 to 4 hours. And going to the diversity, we even talked about that ourselves. Anything over 50% is successful. And we have 652 people saying, yes, it does need to be considered in license renewal. I think it's an excellent survey. I'm real proud of the respondents for doing this. And I think we need to really look at it. And so thank you, staff, for doing this. I'm excited to see the results and see what we can do with it.
Those are great points, Jane. And yes, thank you to the BSRB staff for putting together the Survey Monkey. It takes a lot of effort to do that. And the other thing you said, Jane, I think we really need to hold to is that when we send out surveys like this, we really do need to make sure that we're responding to them and using the feedback to then the next time that we send out a survey, then hopefully more individuals will respond because they're seeing that we're using the data to really make informed decisions.
Right.
That's a good information, Andre. The first one that was sent in 2015, I believe, was not sent to BSWs because the whole survey had to do with whether or not there should be board certified supervisors and training. And so it was only sent out to MSWs and LCSWs, but there's like, and I don't know the exact numbers excluding BSWs, but there was only 500 at that time. So it looks like we bounced from 500 to 1,000. Maybe that has a lot to do with just, offering, gathering feedback from, our licensees statewide. And that's one of the reasons. Plus, we've included BSW students too, you know. It's nice to hear from everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carolyn. Mary, were you going to say something?
Just what I found interesting, the method of how people receive supervision. It seemed like people saw more of a value when it was outside the agency, maybe as opposed to in, maybe looking at that a little bit further too. How people receive that, where it comes from.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Anyone else have some initial thoughts that they'd like to share? All right, so one of the questions then becomes, how do we want to move forward with this data? Which then kind of leads into our next agenda item, which is discussion of committee work for the upcoming year. Carolyn, do you want to start off or say some initial ideas about this particular point?
Well, I would like to say that the clinical supervision training, supervisor training, has been a discussion for many, many years. And currently on the board, we have two professions that were able to bring this to legislation and have it passed. And I think of those two, I think there was a counseling profession, David, correct me if I'm wrong, marriage and family therapist. And we've tried before, but we're not successful. So I think we've always just discussed that. Every year we wonder if we should bring this up again. And we've done a lot of work examining other jurisdictions in the social work field throughout the United States. So it's like, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think out of 50 jurisdictions, social work jurisdictions, there's like 23 states that have required training for their clinical supervisors. Having said that, that's not 100%. So I think we continue to look to see whether we want to, go to pursue this or not. So that's where we're at. And so like the first survey was 2015. So here we are, we're still kind of discussing it. So every year we have the opportunity to make decisions whether we'd like to, and then present that for possible legislation, So I was going to make that comment on, and I think the inclusion is a relatively new subject. This is just brought up from last year. So with this new data, we can continue to revisit that and talk about any changes that we'd like to make.
Thank you, Carolyn. Eric?
Is there any concern at all that the requirement of a training or requirement of a certification will prevent people from doing supervision because they just don't want to go to the extra expense or the extra effort or just don't have the time to keep up that kind of licensing?
I think there has been a few comments and concerns, but there's been a lot of in favor for it too. So that's why we emphasized that any training would be included in their 40 hours. It wouldn't be extra. And that's why we were hoping that if we ever did pursue this, that the training would be reasonable. It wouldn't be 32 hours. So we want to make it very reasonable and doable. But yes, there's been a few that have talked about that. How many? I don't think a great amount of information. I was just thinking too, if you want to see the 2015 survey too, to look at that data, that's helpful as well. But there are people that have expressed that, Eric. I just don't know how many.
I think what we found was with the guidance that we were trying to recommend was trying to help those people who were supervisors understand their role, and then the person who is trying to be supervised understand their role of what they can ask for. And that kind of made it a lot clearer. So then more people were interested in going ahead and pursuing additional social work licensure status because they were able to understand what was going to be asked of them and how they can manage that in their schedules. So anyways, that was, I think, what I took out of that, Carolyn.
Well, and I think we need to look at a bigger issue that is going on right now. And that is we have an exodus of therapists leaving the profession because they don't feel they're prepared and they don't feel that they're getting the support. And so we have to protect that profession. And how do we do that? We do it by wrapping around, our support. Some of that is through supervision and giving them the tools they need to feel, that they are competent. And so we have to do everything we can to instill, our values and our ethics. And some of these, I was alarmed at some of these answers in here and the honesty that was put out here in the survey. I was happy to see that some of them felt that they could be that transparent, but I was also alarmed. And I've been doing this for a long, long time. So I think we need to really listen.
Absolutely, Jane. Mike?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment. I thought that we did make a recommendation to the legislators that they include the requirement, but there was kind of a can't think of the right word for it, but they didn't want to add any additional requirements to the already existing requirements of the legislator, and it just kind of died in their committee that way. Is Carolyn might remember exactly what
Yeah, it wasn't last year or the year before, David. Well, it would have been last year because you presented that information. Was it 2020? Was it last year that we?
I think it was last year.
Right, and it was last year that was removed by.
Yeah, last year there was a section in the bill that would have required there to be board-approved clinical supervisors for social workers. And that section of the bill was amended out of the bill when it went through the committee process. I think some of the discussion that went along at the time that amendment was put on was that there was concern about if someone was choosing between practicing in Kansas versus another state, would an additional requirement make someone more likely to practice in another state than in Kansas? And so I think that was something that was said in those committees when that amendment was made.
Based on the people that were there to test it, to testify. So, and there was some concern about cost, and Eric, that was brought up there too. But even though it was stated that it would be included with the 40-hour renewal, there'd be no additional cost. But yeah. So
I think there was a piece of it that was attached that we were wanting it to be pulled back.
Another piece?
I was thinking we wanted to rework it.
I think it might have been dealing with the distant supervision situation. Could they do it through telecommunications like we are right now, or if they could, there was something we were putting in there, but anyway.
Yeah, I think, there initially there was some of the individuals that were testifying against that, they had some concerns. And I thought we provided some pretty good information to address a lot of those concerns, because there was one about that it would be more additional continuing education hours above what was already being required. And we clarified that no, this wasn't above the 40. This was within the 40. It just had to be in those areas. And then there was a question about, could people do this if there weren't those supervision, if there was a lack of availability for the supervision hours. But the bill also opened up the ability to receive supervision over televideo. And so that really addressed some of the availability of that concern. So I think most of the concerns were addressed. I think one of the remaining ones was just an additional requirement for that level of practitioner. At least I recall that as from the people who made the motion. Some of those individuals highlighted that.
So when there's testimony, sometimes there's one individual, sometimes there's organizations, and so, it's based on who's there, and
Right.
who's not
Right.
there, that makes a huge difference on, what happens, I believe. And, but did you mention too, that they had, there was a concern about, well, there wouldn't be enough training availabilities, and we kind of looked at that. And there's an enormous amount of trainings on clinical supervision that's available online, and so those were concerns, though.
Yeah, and one thing that kind of hurt us a little bit too, and this is just just the way that it worked. So you have a number of bills that are introduced, and there's a lack of not a lot of time for those hearings. And so if there's a lot of individuals requesting to provide testimony, they usually, in some of those committees, will limit the time. And I think on some of those committees, I think they only gave people about 2 minutes to speak,
Right.
which meant that you might have 16 reasons why you like this bill, and then you have one concern. But if you have 16 minutes to speak, I think some people said, well, instead of talking about those 16 reasons I like this bill, I'm just going to talk about my one concern. And
Right.
so it kind of creates a weird.
It was real time limited. So, and even you were even pushed to hurry along. So, I mean, so the quality of the information was quite limited because of time restraints. And granted, they have many more things to do than just listening to this issue. So, yeah, I felt that pressure. And I think others who testified felt that same pressure as well. So.
But for them also educating them with something like a survey so that they can see data is something that is supporting,
Right.
for legislators. They want to see true data.
Yeah, and of that survey, the 2015 survey, there was like close to 90% of people that were in favor. And this was MSW's, LSCSW's responses. And of course, there were some that weren't, but I think we did, the survey was mentioned, but it was briefly, but they, like David showed this survey, where we were able to visually see that, I don't think they were able to visualize. Of course, there wasn't very much time to go over all those things.
Right.
So I would argue or make the point that I believe this committee is, or this action is something we're interested in pursuing, because I think the question was what committee assignments or what kind of things we would like to do in this upcoming year.
Which would include this. Yeah, this is one area, as well as the CEU inclusion. Those are at least two things, but maybe there are other things you would wish to include. I think, Andre, is that the question too? Are there other areas things that we'd like to work on this year?
Yeah, so it sounds like what I'm gathering is we would address the issue of clinical supervision, and then also the DEI requirement within the CEUs. And so I have those two items. I also have noted just discussing the workforce shortage and concerns around that. I don't know. I think we'd have to be a little bit more specific on how that would, what BSRB, Social Work Advisory Committee, could address in that area. But I definitely think it is a concern, Jane. We are seeing just an increase in workforce shortage in all areas, not just rural areas anymore. So those are the things that I have heard. Are there any other items that this committee would like to bring up?
In our license, the social work license, do we have reciprocity?
Reciprocity with other states?
Yes.
We have a reciprocity statute and regulation, but it's not necessarily with each state. It's we look at their requirements compared to ours.
Okay, so it is based on if their requirements is like our requirements.
Uh-huh.
Okay,
Or if they've been licensed for and practicing for 4 years. If their requirements are different, they can practice for 4 years and then come over.
oh, okay, okay.
Yeah,
That's
we
what-
also have that. There's also that new bill that involves military members and military spouses, and that
Right.
specifically addresses the reciprocity too. So
Yes, the military, I understood. Okay. The 4-year one is probably what was the confusing one for me. Okay.
I can tell you, there are, right now, the statute says that your state requirements have to be substantially equivalent to ours for the LMSW, which means they have to have a CSWE accredited master's and have taken the ASWB exam either at the master's or the clinical level. And then that's considered substantially equivalent. Wrong one.
All right, well, I know it's 3 o'clock. I didn't know if anybody else had another item. We can certainly also ask again the next time we meet if people have had an opportunity to think of something. But for right now, it looks like we have those 2 areas that we'll be focusing on: clinical supervision and diversity, equity, and inclusion CEU requirement. All right, the other thing on our agenda is discussion on unprofessional conduct regulations. David?
sure. And this kind of goes on that list as well. So in your packet, there was one more document you received, and that is the unprofessional conduct regulations for the social work profession. So one thing that I have asked each of the advisory committees to do is to read through the unprofessional conduct regulations for their profession. And then between now and the next meeting, sort of as homework, to bring back any recommended changes. Be thinking about, is there anything missing from these rules of professional conduct that you believe would be appropriate to have included? Is there anything that maybe is appropriate to be removed? Is the terminology and phrasings still appropriate? Some of this language might have been added a long time ago. Is it still the way that we understand those terminology, those terms today? Also be thinking about it in terms of some items that we discussed last year. For example, the rise of telehealth services being provided. Is that still something that we can look to these rules of unprofessional conduct and really apply in a lot of telehealth situations? Concerning topics like social media. If we think about social media, is the language still appropriate here in the unprofessional conduct regulations? And so we have recently received some bills that have been introduced by the legislature that have really, in my opinion, attacked regulations by agencies. I think with the idea that some agencies don't revise them in a timely manner and may not review them very often. And so I think as our responsibility is to follow the statutes and regulations, what I'm asking each of the advisory committees to do is review the ones specific to their profession and then bring back recommendations. And this is part of a larger process to familiarize yourself with those statutes and regulations for your profession. But I thought as a public protection agency, the good place for us to start would be these rules of unprofessional conduct. So between now and then, go ahead and review them, familiarize yourself with them, and then come back ready to discuss any potential changes at the next advisory committee meeting.
And I think clarity too, sometimes they're difficult to interpret, not these, but I think we could look for clarity or different ways of making things more clear.
All right, committee, we have our first homework assignment for the year. So thank you, David. We'll add that on to what we'll discuss, one of our priority areas for this year. I also did just want to point out, because I didn't mention this, going back to keeping that workforce shortage item just still on the items that we want to address. But I know, again, like I mentioned, we'll have to figure out what really can this committee focus on in that area. So we'll just keep that on the radar. All right, the next agenda item is committee discussion on items for next meeting. Are there any thoughts, recommendations, suggestions on what we might want to include in addition to the items that we just discussed on our next agenda? We want to make sure to get input from everybody on the committee, so it's not just Carolyn, myself, and David coming up with the agendas on a monthly, bi-monthly basis.
Also, if you think of something after this meeting, at the very beginning of the meeting, when we talk about we look at agenda approval, you can always add at that point too. So if you can't think of anything right now, you can always bring forth any subject.
Absolutely, good point. All right, well, with that, we'll move on to our next meeting is on Tuesday, April 19th at 1 p.m. And we'll be sending out an invite for that particular meeting, and it'll be via Zoom at this point. So next item is adjournment. May I please get a motion to adjourn today's meeting?
I move that we adjourn today's meeting.
Thank you, Carolyn. May I get a second?
I'd second.
Thank you, Donna. Second. Any opposed? All those in favor say aye.
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 All right. So
Welcome, everybody.
yes, welcome. This meeting is adjourned. We will see you in April. Thank you for your input and your time.
All right. Thank you for your hard work, everybody.
Take care.